Marcus. I don't know how to turn that. Okay, let's recite Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillahi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Allahumma ya munawwir ya fattah. نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. صلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah. So I think this is going to be our last class in this series. Inshallah. We'll see if I can get to the end and I don't go off on too many tangents. But then after that, I'm hoping that we're going to get into a study of the seerah, inshallah. And we'll see kind of like the start time and end time for that. We're going to go into the post-classical period. So this period is the period after the classical period. And again, this taxonomy is somewhat porous because we're really just making this up. Typically, historians will try and give these time periods to give us some dialogical control over what's happening. Certain ideas and concepts and trends seem to flourish in certain times, and they become markers to help us delineate what that time is in comparison to different times. So the post-classical period generally is going to be between the 13th century till the modern period, the turn of modernity, which is around the year 1800 or so. So this is really between the 13th century and the 19th century. This period has a massive effect on the way that we as Muslims today understand our religion, relate to our religion, and in many ways, it even has an ontological, conception that comes through as well, where we even see ourselves in many ways vis-a-vis what has been said of this tradition in the post-classical period and the history or the narrative that has basically defined what Muslims did during this period. And we're going to talk about that, inshallah. One of the things that I remember very vividly, leaving this country, and I was born overseas, but not really, I didn't spend much time there, right? So I was born in Alexandria. I was actually born in Cairo and we moved to Alexandria. And then I was there maybe until 5 or 6 years old. And then we left and went to Kenosha, Wisconsin, of all places, which was kind of off the radar for many people for years until that last incident happened. But anyway, so that's the city that I basically was raised in. And then between Wisconsin, Chicago, and Egypt, my whole life. One of the things that was really apparent to me, especially when I would go back to Egypt, is the lens that many of the family members and friends in the community there had in seeing themselves in light of a lot of Western intellectual thought and development, where the West kind of became the standard on many levels. And I'm not just talking about the elites, by the way. I mean, the elites in these societies have a particular disposition to them, but that disposition definitely has a trickle-down effect. So it affects the way that many in that country, if not everyone in that country and others, see where the sort of aspirational objectives lie. And because of that, it affects everybody. And I kept thinking to myself, Like, where are these things coming from? For me, actually growing up here, I don't know if this idea maybe resonates with others. I never really quite saw myself as being from here. And this is kind of like the struggle of the immigrant, right? It's just like you're not from here, and then you've been here for so long, and then you go back, and you're not really from there, and you're kind of like in limbo. You're not really sure where you belong per se. But I was very aware of the fact that there was a lens that seemed to be so filtered through the Western historical experience that everyone overseas in these Muslim majority countries saw themselves through. And it was one of the questions that I had in trying to address, like, what happened within our tradition and how to make sense of that in light of the way that we understand our religion today. And what I found, and I could be wrong, Allahu A'lam, is that so much of it comes out of this period, this post-classical period. This era has been coined by many Orientalist scholars. And Orientalists are who? They're just Westerners who sought to study the quote-unquote Orient, or the East, basically, the Muslim world, through a very particular paradigmatic approach. They had certain assumptions that they made, and they asked very specific questions, oftentimes, again, filtered through the lens of the West and their own historical trajectory to try to make sense of these people and their religion and their way of life, right? So these individuals who studied Muslims, they basically coined this period as the stagnation and decline period of Islamic history, right? And this narrative was seen and reiterated over and over again. It most likely started from Reynold Nicholson, who was an Orientalist scholar, wrote the literary history of the Arabs. And there's a really interesting quote from him here. Let me share my screen so that way the people on Zoom see it as well. Mashallah, assalamu alaikum. Welcome. No, not at all. Welcome, welcome. Okay, so here's the quote. This is Nicholson on the history of the Arabs. He says, quote, "But with one or two conspicuous exceptions, for example, the historian Ibn Khaldun and the mystic Sha'rani, we cannot point to any new departure, any fruitful ideas, any trace of original and illuminating thought, i.e. in the Islamic world. The 15th and 16th centuries witnessed the rise and triumph of that wonderful movement known as the Renaissance. But no ripple of this great upheaval, which changed the whole current of intellectual and moral life in the West, reached the shores of Islam." So this narrative basically argues that the post-classical Islamic world was bereft of rational sciences and any real development, and particularly any scientific achievements, since that's going to be like the standard, that had flourished in the generations that had preceded this particular point in time. Now, alhamdulillah, this narrative has been seriously challenged in recent scholarship. But for some reason, you still find that there are people who really want to hold on to this idea. And unfortunately, you also have Muslims, and sometimes even Muslim scholars, who have often appropriated from Orientalists and adopt this narrative as part and parcel of the way that they make sense of the tradition. And I believe it to be very problematic. And they've been basically teaching that at some point after the Mongol invasion, which is like mid-13th century, the sacking of Baghdad, which was kind of like a watershed moment in Muslim history. Like this was a moment that Muslims remember, right? Right around the year 1258 or so. The Muslim world, shortly after that point in time, go into the stagnation and decline, right? What does stagnation mean? Yeah, it's just nothing happens. Like in other words, it's doing the exact same thing. Nobody's really doing anything new in the Muslim world. And then that then turns into decline, right? Where now it's not that we're not just doing anything. Now it's like negative, right? And we're continually going down this sort of downward trajectory up until we get to even the modern period. And then they say, and see, look at the Muslim world today. Look at what they look like. Look at what they're doing. And then look at the West and look at what we look like and look at what we're doing and look at the kind of advancements that we have in science and technology and all these things, and look at them, right? Incapable of adopting the necessary tools to bring them into modernity and really allow them to flourish during this time. Now, some even want to argue that it was Imam al-Ghazali himself who contributed to this like stagnation and decline as a result of his work, the Heft al-Falasifa, which was the incoherence of the philosophers. And I talked a little bit about this before. Okay, he wrote this text, The Incoherence of the Philosopher. And we went through it when we looked at his text, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, to try and show like what was his project actually about. Was this a man who was simply taking all of philosophy, which at that time would have included the trivium and the quadrivium and, you know, math, science, literature, the whole nine, right? The way that we think about natural philosophy and the way that we think about the hard sciences today would have been synonymous, okay? Was he simply saying Muslims shouldn't get involved in any of these things? And, you know, as Neil deGrasse Tyson loves to say online constantly, he basically said math is from shaitan, and so Muslims shouldn't get involved in doing anything mathematical. And then it's like, from that point forward, Muslims are just on this downward trajectory. Is that really what happened? Is that really what Imam al-Ghazali said? No. Okay, and anybody who has read Imam al-Ghazali knows that that's the case. As a matter of fact, he's very clear about what sciences there are no problems with in terms of how we engage with philosophy, and then those things that we do have an issue when it comes to philosophy. Right? Now, Ibn Rushd, interestingly enough, who was a philosopher, one of the Islamic philosophers, comes after Imam al-Ghazali. He writes a refutation of this work called Heft, the incoherence of the incoherence. But it's written that the Muslim world ends up going down the route of Imam al-Ghazali, and then the Western world, as a result of Catholic appropriation, they go down the route of Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. Okay, and that's why you see the Muslim world where it is today and the Western world where it is today. This is a very strange summary of what happened, and it definitely does not illustrate the development of our tradition. It doesn't illustrate, it doesn't correspond to reality, because if you look historically speaking, it's just empirically false, right? And there are a whole slew of assumptions that are made that then become used as a kind of imperializing narrative against Muslims. You see, like, you know, they want to kind of point at you and say, you're inferior to us. And it isn't until you adopt our way of thinking and our way of living and the sciences that we have developed that you will finally come into your full human potential. But insofar as you're shackled to these archaic concepts of, you know, Islam and tradition and traditionalism and all these things, you're going to be stuck there and you're never going to move forward. And literally everything that we see, I mean, not everything, I'm being hyperbolic because I'm Arab, right? But so much of what we see in the media carries that narrative, even in cartoons, by the way, especially in cartoons, where it's always about this, you know, the princess or the guy or whoever it is, that their whole struggle throughout the entire film is simply just breaking free of the shackles of tradition and coming into their own, this unprecedented way of thinking and living life that they have to work really, really hard to break out of. And as soon as they do, they, you know, everybody kind of cheers them on and thanks them for doing it. And we're finally now here, liberated. It's a very simplistic concept, and it in many ways has gone completely against the notion that we within the Muslim tradition would see as being beneficial to humanity, because so much of who we are depends on our understanding of our ancestors and really taking that serious, not assuming that they must be inferior because they came before us, right? No, let's actually look at what they said and see And I'm not saying that they were perfect, but as it stands right now, we carry a very sort of arrogant disposition in the modern world, where we look at anything that happened before the time period that we're in right now as necessarily inferior to where we are today, right? And that has to be challenged. So, first of all, historically speaking, after Imam al-Ghazali, there's a massive integration effort of Ibn Sina with Sunni Kalam. And we looked at this discipline of Kalam, theology, and what it is and how it works from a very general perspective. And we also looked at the Falasifa. So everybody remember that discussion that we had about the Falasifa and what they believe and kind of their whole grid of existence and how it worked. Now, it's interesting. There's a scholar at McGill University named Robert Wisnowski. He basically says that this integration effort happens during Imam al-Ghazali himself, where Muslim Sunni theologians are integrating Ibn Sina's thought into our normative tradition. I agree with his assessment at some point, at some level, but I think that the real work of the quote unquote synthesis project that happens was done at the hands of scholars after Imam al-Ghazali, and particularly with Fakhruddin al-Razi. Fakhruddin al-Razi is a giant, an intellectual giant. And really, when you look at the tradition of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we are so indebted to Fakhruddin al-Razi on so many levels. And I think it's important for us to know him and to know these names too, right? You may not think it's a big deal, but it actually is a really big deal to know who these individuals are. There's also a narrative that's made to present Imam al-Ghazali as kind of like the beginning and end of Islamic thought. Like it all kind of like begins and ends with Imam al-Ghazali. He is everything. And that's just not true. He's amazing. And there is much to be gleaned about what his project actually was in putting into perspective what these disciplines are supposed to do, i.e. bring you to Jannah and keep you out of hellfire. But really, the truth is much of our tradition as Sunnis is a product of what happens after Imam al-Ghazali. Like this full-fledged program was enacted by Imam al-Razi. Fakhruddin al-Razi, I would even argue, is probably one of the greatest minds in human history. His works in Kalam and Falsafa are massively significant to Sunni thought, and they go into far more depth than anything that preceded him. So the point is, this idea that Imam al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd depict the contending philosophies and trajectories of the future of Islam and Muslims and Europe is absurd, right? If you want to really get more of a understanding as to what the contending philosophies were, especially for Muslims in this time period, it would be much more synonymous with saying Fakhruddin al-Razi on one side and Nasiruddin al-Tusi on the other side. The way that those two individuals were going to integrate Ibn Sina, the way that they were going to develop a philosophical program, that has much more significance in what's happening in this time period than to say there was Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, Europe went with Ibn Rushd, the Muslims went with Ghazali, and here we are today. Okay? Now, why is this also an absurdity insofar as the way that we would look at history? The idea that our tradition went stagnant after Imam al-Ghazali, it doesn't account for the seminal figures and texts of like the Sunni scholarly tradition, all of who were gleaning from al-Razi's contributions in many ways. So for example, you have people like al-Katibi, who died in 1277 CE, or Qutb al-Razi, al-Qadi al-Baydawi, Sadr al-Sharia, Shamsuddin al-Asfahani, Aduddin al-Iji. Aduddin al-Iji is like the seminal theologian of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah in the post-classical period. How many people here have heard his name? Exactly. Sa'ad al-Taftazani, Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani, Alauddin Ali al-Qushti. Alauddin Ali al-Qushti was probably the greatest astronomer in the world. And again, not being hyperbolic, even though I am Arab. In the world, in the 15th century. Okay. Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Sanusi, who we studied his theological treatise, Jalal al-Dawani, al-Hasan al-Yusi, and we can continue going on and on and on and on and on. And this is already now, al-Hasan al-Yusi is in 17th century, almost 18th century. The point is, this is not a stagnant tradition at all. These authors contributed a lot, and a lot of it was unprecedented insofar as the internal discursive tradition of Muslims, right? Thirdly, the claim of like a sudden halt in scientific inquiry in the Muslim world in this time period is also false. Like Muslims just stopped doing science because Ghazali told us that mathematics was from shaitan. How absurd is that? Anyways, I like get heated just talking about this topic. It doesn't account for the massive number of Muslim scientific figures that come after Imam Ghazali and after the Mongols, right? Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi in 1231, Ibn al-Baytar in 1248, al-Urdi, Nasiruddin al-Tusi that we just talked about, Qutbuddin al-Shirazi, Kamal al-Din al-Farisi, Ibn al-Shatir, Jamshid al-Kashi, Qadi Zad al-Rumi, all of these people, Ulugh Beg in 1449, sorry. All of these individuals and more were amazing scientists, people who contributed greatly to the field of science. And in general, from the 8th to the 15th century, the Islamic civilization was the foremost scientific civilization of its time. Neither the Chinese nor the Western civilizations could compete with it in terms of science. Also, the scientific texts that were produced by the Muslims between the 12th and the 19th century exceeds that of the Greek and the Latin texts combined. So again, does that seem like a time period that went through stagnation and decline, scientifically speaking? No. Yeah.
So in the face of all this evidence that Muslims that the Islamic empires were like, how do Oriental scholars kind of reframe that and be like, after Imam Hussein, Muslims have something? Like, how do they contextualize that in the face of all that evidence?
They just never really went into it. I mean, it's almost as simple as that. They knew that those figures, some of those figures existed, but the problem was they were looking for certain types of questions, and they were assuming, in history, there's a term that's often used when you think about a tradition void of the lens that is paradigmatic of that tradition, and you're trying to sort of assume your own paradigm onto that tradition, okay? From a historical perspective, they would say that that's anachronistic. You start asking questions about concepts that only come about as a result of the nation state, and you want to see like how does that concept work in the 12th century? Well, that's ridiculous. There was no nation state in the 12th century, so it'd be completely absurd to try and assume that that concept even applies. So when we're thinking about these concepts, we also have to be very clear as to, were these individuals who were studying the Muslims capable of going into this post-classical literature? And the answer is no. And part of the reason, as many have shown in academia today, one of them was my advisor, is because a lot of that work was being done in commentaries and glosses, right? So the Hawashi tradition is a very different type of tradition. And if anybody's ever tried to read one of these texts, you know how difficult this is, right? Even Arab who are just like interested and kind of like open up these old books and see, on the margins, what they call them marginalia. So it's like text that's commenting on the commentary that's outside of the periphery of the pages. And then you also have to like figure out, okay, well, what's being said and who said it to who and what exactly does this relate to as it relates to the actual source text, metin. It's very difficult. And it's definitely not the project of these scholars, for sure. And as has been made readily available today, scholars who are working in departments, Islamic studies, religious studies, philosophy, history departments, so on and so forth, here in this country, at all of the major universities who are doing good work will tell you that, yeah, they got it wrong, right? Now, I also don't want you to hear what I'm saying as like, there's just, you know, when we look at what happened to Muslims and we look at what happened to the Western world, we should kind of like turn a blind eye and not really call a spade, as it is. Like, you know, like nothing went wrong in the Muslim world, or that everything is completely okay with Islamic civilization as it stands today. Like, I'm also not saying that, okay? But really the question that they're asking, and we should be very specific about what they're trying to ask, is why was there no scientific or technological revolution that happened in the Muslim world? Why did it happen in the West? That's actually the question that people are asking, okay? And I would argue that the reason that was given, because the Ghazali came and wrote this book, and no, that's not what happened. If you look closely, and I could be wrong, Allahu A'lam, but if you look closely at what's happening in this time period, I would say that it was because there was a focus within the Islamic world that began to lean much more heavily falsafa than it did that old school program of kalam in the classical period. In other words, what I mean by that is Ibn Sina became very influential, and a particular program of Ibn Sina became very influential. That way of science, doing science, became very influential. And the Ash'ari, who held down the old school positions, they didn't really provide a viable, robust alternative to the program that Ibn Sina presented, right? And those were things that were being worked on in the post-classical period. The ulama, who were very critical of the scientific paradigm of Aristotelian and Ibn Sina's natural philosophy, their work faced a lot of resistance. And it was because of how much clout Ibn Sina had and how certain thinkers came and went hard to support and strengthen Ibn Sina's philosophy during that time. The other schools weren't really able to break free. Like if you look at the Ash'ari in the later period, Razi was incredibly critical of everyone that came before. The Mutakallimun, the Ash'ari that came before him, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and he was very critical of natural philosophy. He tried his best to redirect things in a different direction from Ibn Sina and the earlier Mutakallimun, and to try to take it to a whole new level. And to a certain degree, one can say that he succeeded, but there was still a lot of pushback, primarily from Tusi. But if you notice, especially the Ash'ari in Iran, they became increasingly more partial to Ibn Sina and that program, to the extent that their arguments, even just to substantiate their claims, became, you know, Sarrah al-Shaykh al-Shifat. Like it must be true. The Shaykh in the Shifat said it. And that became kind of their argument, right? One second. So if you look though, in comparison, if you look at Central Asian scholars, they were incredibly critical. And they probably did manage to succeed in allowing, for instance, astronomy to break free out of the mold of Ibn Sina. But the school dwindled and it died out. Okay, so scholars like Sadr Sharia, Mahboubi, Alauddin Ali Qushti that I mentioned, these were probably the best astronomers in the world at that time. But after Al-Qushti's work on astronomy in Sharh Tajreed was produced and it began gaining traction, it got rejected by later astronomers. So for example, and this is an amazing text, Qushti provides an argument against the impossibility of the Earth's rotation around itself. Like he refutes that notion. Far before Regiomontis, far before the Copernican revolution, like this was being done by an individual in the Islamic world a century or two before the Copernican revolution. And why? Why does he even refute that notion? Why is it an issue for him? He refutes it because he says, I don't have commitments to Aristotle and Ibn Sina's natural philosophy. Like he explicitly says, look, guys, astronomy is not based on the natural philosophy of the philosophers. It's based on evident premises, sense perception, evident syllogisms with a suppressed premise, like what's known as hadas in the literature. And we can establish astronomy and its truths without any reference to anything that the philosophers are saying, right? And the others, I would say, who were too enamored with Ibn Sina, they weren't really happy about this, and they weren't really happy with Qushti. And Qushti, Ash'ari, Hanafi, from Central Asia, Uzbekistan, which has always been very somewhat anti-Ibn Sina, which contrasts with scholars of Shiraz, who include people like Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani, Dawani, etc., who are much more pro-Ibn Sina with a very particular type of program in mind. And I would submit that their paradigm beat out the other one, and they became the dominant figures in the parts of the Muslim world that held wealth to develop scholarship, like in India and in the Ottoman Empire. Okay? So you have two different programs, and I'm not saying that one is better than the other. They're just different, and they do have implications insofar as the way that that program is being established and kind of driving during this time period. And I believe that they actually are both extremely relevant to the discussion that we're having today. And this is part of our tradition. It's rich, it's vast, and it's beautiful. North Africa during this time increasingly becomes more impoverished, and it leaves them incapable of supporting scholarship at the level of what's happening outside of it. Egypt during this time starts to pick up the pace insofar as their development in the rational sciences. So like in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, Al-Azhar really becomes Al-Azhar as we think of it in that particular era, where they mount the Shaykh Al-Azhar as a position, and they cultivate a tremendous amount of intellectual activity during that time. And then post Hassan Attar, things begin to move into a very different direction, right? So you have individuals like Sanusi, and then everyone after Sanusi who's kind of following in that particular project up until Hassan Attar. And then you have a very different take on how this is all moving, right? Interestingly, today, there are still people in the subcontinent who have been continuously studying the philosophical tradition of natural philosophy, like the philosophy of Ibn Sina, and who still hold that the Earth is at the center of the solar system. And they're not doing this because of some commitment that they have to Quran and Sunnah. It's because they're so steeped in Ibn Sina's natural philosophy that they actually provide refutations of that based on Ptolemaic geometry. And they're reading very advanced books, right? Like Al-Abhari and these people. My point is, philosophy in the Muslim world certainly did not die. And quite possibly because it did not, quote unquote, die, there was no scientific revolution. There was a program that had become far too dominant in the way that Muslims conceptualized how we were doing philosophy, that they never really allowed for this other program that was also developing side by side to flourish in that way. Does that make sense? Okay. This is a very important point. And partially because insofar as we think about our epistemology, that big word that always seems people doing this work. What is epistemology? Study of knowledge, yeah. I can never say epistemology or ontology and not think of Harun Sujit. It's like, whatever you do, don't be that guy who says, epistemologically speaking. Yes. Ontologically speaking. I have to find a different word or something. Insofar as the sources of knowledge that we have as Muslims, okay? We said that there were three. What are they? Hukm aqli, rational judgments, empirical judgments, and revelation. All right. These three modalities are a much more expansive understanding of how we can come into knowledge than the modern world. And also it challenged the way that many in that early pre-modern period would have understood how one arrives at knowledge. So insofar as I know things from this world, okay, I have a very particular type of understanding of what type of truth claim I'm able to derive from the world. If I let go of these glasses, what happens? It falls down. And the reason that I know that, and I can trust it, and I have certainty in it, is because I've seen it, I observe it, I test it, And based on those tests and observations of repeated patterns, I'm able to come into an understanding of what's going on. Okay. Now, hukum adi, because it is what it is, there's also something that's very important to understand about it. And we've talked about this before. We've said in the past that the entirety of the world was created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The entirety of the world is contingent, which means it's possible. What does that mean? Ultimately, what that means is that we came into existence from non-existence. And khuliqu min ghayri shay'. Did you come from nothing? Were you created from nothing? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us. No. We know that intuitively. Why? Because we know that at one point we weren't here, and then we were here. And we know that there's nothing necessary about our existence, which means that we're contingent, including the existence of the world itself. So the world and everything in it is contingent. All right? What that means then is that the way that we come to understand what exactly the world is and how it behaves, how it relates to other contingent things in the world is not necessary. So when I say, for example, I let go of this object and it falls down, that's a relationship between me, my hand, and these glasses and me letting it go. Okay? And what that means is that I could in fact do what it is that I'm doing. And if the glasses don't fall down, that's possible. Because we just said that it's contingent, I'm contingent, and the relationship between me and it is also contingent. All right? That's what allows for us to understand what miracles are. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran to Ibrahim, to the fire, Kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim, and Ibrahim is thrown alayhi salatu salam into the fire, it doesn't burn him. But we know, based on our empirical observation of fire and flammable objects, that those two things mean that this is going to involve burning, right? I have fire, I have a flammable object, they come together, you have burning. But because the fire is contingent, and because the flammable object is contingent, and because their relationship is also contingent, it means that if it burns, it's possible. And if it doesn't burn, it's also possible. There's no necessary relationship between those two things. Right? And this is going to be very important for the mutakallimun, because what they're ultimately saying is the only real understanding that I can have of the world as it behaves in this way is based on patterns. There are patterns that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. They're not necessary. I would assume that those are the patterns, but I know that ultimately the effects that I'm seeing in this world, all of them, including this very moment right now, is created by God. And if he chooses to create it in this way, then that's what it will be. And if he chooses to create it in a completely different way, then that's what it will be. And he's not obligated to create something specific. Otherwise, you're having to say now that there's something that causes God to create in a particular way, which means he's contingent, which means he wouldn't be God. All right? Based on this understanding, they invented the category of hukum adi. They said, listen, if you know anything about the world, you have to observe it, the way that it behaves, understand it, and then provide a model that gives us a way of understanding how this data is behaving. And if it changes, no problem, change the model. And if it changes so much, in which there are so many outliers to the system that we can't really make sense of the model anymore, scrap the model and provide a different model. What does that sound like? What? Yeah, somebody said it. Scientific method. And we have Ahsan here, so he can check me from that. It's a scientific method. The scientific method that we're all sort of enamored by, that we love so much, that has allowed for the modern world to be modern in that sense. Yeah. Where did it come from? As far as I can tell, it came from the Muslims. And in particular, it came from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah in this early period. So that's the first thing, right? we are able to know certain types of truths vis-a-vis our sense perception. Then we have rational knowledge, things that I can know vis-a-vis the pure reason that God has given us, the intellect that I have, that allows me to know certain things using universal, abstract concepts that I know correspond to reality. Half of 2 is what? 1. Do you need to empirically show me that that actually works in order to know that that's true? No. And this, by the way, I'm glad that there was like a hesitancy. Right? You have to do it, and they're like, this is something that for us as modern folks, especially being educated out here in the West, we have a very difficult time with. Because we've been made to believe that everything that you know, even these rational categories, you came to know it through empiricism. And that's just not the case. Okay. These are concepts that's abstracted in the mind that you're able to arrive at, and they're conclusive. They do provide necessary truth claims. They're necessary. It can never be anything other than what that conclusion is. Does that make sense? So the mind ultimately is a capacity that we've been given that allows us to arrive at certain conclusions, void of empiricism. And then lastly, revelation. Yeah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to his prophet, who tells us things about reality that neither the mind, i.e. the intellect, nor our sense perceptions can arrive at. Like what? Like heaven and hell are real. And it's going to happen. When you die, 2 angels named Munkar and Nakir are going to come ask you 3 questions. Can the mind arrive at that? No. You can think for the rest of your life. As a matter of fact, take all the lives that you want. You'll never arrive at that conclusion with the aql alone. You have to be told through revelation that that's a category. So these 3 categories, aql, intellect, pure reason, empiricism, and revelation, make up this expansive understanding that Muslims use to say we can know things in these various modalities, and all of them allow for us to know how to do life properly in terms of our religion, in terms of civilization building, and they all work synonymously with each other. They don't contradict one another, and they provide a type of harmony ultimately that have made Muslim civilizations in the past flourish in ways that are profound, like I've talked about here, that inshallah we revive in the time that we live. Okay, you have a question? Sorry. Sorry. I'm like trying to make sure that I get that out today. So, yeah. Yeah. Yes, what are the 3 questions? Who's your Lord? What's your religion? Who's your prophet? No, no. This is like an open note test. It's really quickly here. It's 1 second. No, because the next world is a world of meaning. So what ultimately you are saying and doing is reflective of the meanings that you've cultivated. And so what you're answering ultimately becomes what your reality actually was. Did you actually believe in this? And this goes back to the importance of kalam. Like, do I really have to know why this religion is true? Well, it seems like you do, right? Insofar as answering those questions, it's not like, I just know what to say. I've been given the answers. So these are meanings ultimately that are being expressed, and they take on forms, right? So, in this world, meanings are abstract concepts. You don't see them in the extra-mental world. Like I don't run into a number 2 as I'm walking down the street or something. The number 2 is an abstraction in mind. In the next world, those concepts actually take on form. Like the Prophet ﷺ says that death will come in the form of a ram, and he'll slaughter it. And we will come to realize in our very state of being that there's no more death. Like, what is that? It's a very different conceptual framework. Which is why they say that people that have entered into a particular realm, when they try to talk about what happened there, here, you should just not do that. Anyways, any questions about this? This is the post-classical period. Now, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We don't have the water, but I can see what happened. How
It's a good question. So have you all seen this clip? So the question basically is Neil deGrasse Tyson, in this comment that he made about Muslims in this time period and Ghazali and where Muslims are today, he even additionally said, and I didn't mention this, but he said, when you look at how many Muslims there are in the world, they far exceed the amount of Jews, for example, that are in this world. Yet when you look at the amount of Nobel laureates that are Jewish in comparison to the amount of Nobel laureates that are Muslims, the Jewish community has like, I don't know how many, hundreds, and the Muslims have how many to date? It's like 2 or 3, right? And so he's saying, you see how important intellectual concepts are in a civilization, like what they can do to a civilization. Now that's really befitting in many ways to kind of grant this imperializing narrative and to make it seem as if, the West is where they are because they were just like these really smart individuals who did things the right way, lifted the shackles of religion and traditionalism off of themselves, and Muslims are where they are because of that. But you're also not having to dismiss a whole lot of other things, like colonialism and imperialism. Or also maybe just because of the fact that for years and years and years and years and years, people were entering into these lands and killing off the scholars one by one every single day, and then completely reshaped the way that education was going to be done in these countries, pillaged the land and completely turned that entire society upside down. I mean, do you want to take responsibility for that or not? And the way that he's answering this question obviously shows that he's not. And this is part of the problem with people like Sam Harris too. If you ever hear Sam Harris talk about Islam, he wants to talk about Islam as basically like the problem with Islam, fundamentally speaking, and the reason why Islam is the way that Muslims are the way that they are today is because of their source texts. Like it really just comes down to the fact that, we have these hadiths and the Quranic texts that are misinterpreted by this marginal group of people who seem to have gotten it right, and Muslims are like kind of living in cognitive dissonance in relationship to their texts. Like history is secondary, resource politics are secondary, arms deals are secondary, political instability is secondary, sectarian issues are like maybe less so because he can pigeonhole them into some kind of narrative he has of Islam. But all of the social and the economic and foreign policy and geographical and historical and political issues that are really driving these crises in the Middle East are all totally secondary to like a few polls that he likes to talk about and out of context Quranic quotes and hadiths. Like those are the issues. That's what's ultimately causing all of these problems. And not only is it what is driving these problems, but this is the biggest threat in the world today. Like that is a interesting take. And to me, he gets away with it because he doesn't ever address any of these realities. Okay. So I would say Neil deGrasse Tyson seems to be in that same boat, right? Well, I would talk about taking accountability for like the full picture. I mean, and again, I'm not saying what I'm saying right now because this did become kind of part of an ideological movement of Muslims in the modern period, where they used the narrative of, you know, Muslims were in the past these great people who did everything that the West then took and, you know, went to the moon with. And in many ways, they used it as a means of dismissing actually ever doing anything about the problem, like actually uplifting and inspiring Muslims to really engage the world properly, to fulfill their human potential. I'm not doing that either. I'm just saying, if we are going to rectify the issue, okay, we have to know what the issue actually is. We can't just make something up because it seems to fit some narrative and then address that. Does that make sense? Okay, now this brings us back to a conversation that we had at the beginning of this course. We talked about modernism right off the sort of like the first discussion that we had, as a matter of fact, was a discussion around what are the very specific and concrete institutional and epistemological and economic and social institutions that make up what modernism is, okay? And we talked about capitalism and post-enlightenment morality, the nation state, materialism, skepticism, secularism, and colonialism, okay? And I want us for a second to try and like recapture that discussion, because it's extremely important in thinking about everything that we've taken thus far and how we as a civilization today think about where we came from, who our ancestors were, what the program actually was that they developed for us, and whether or not it gives us the ability to engage the world that we live in today, not only to benefit ourselves as a community, but for the benefit of humanity. Like, do we really see that as being something that's plausible from the tradition itself? We said that the modern paradigm is a Western, secular, materialistic, and very Euro-Christian centric paradigm, okay? And we also talked about the fact that there were these particular issues that derive out of our understanding of modernism that have to be addressed. Do we have the tools to do that? That's an actual question. What's that? Do we have the tools to take on all of these issues from within our tradition? So you all see that? Yeah. That's true. And we're not even saying that that's the objective. Yeah, because that's a tall task, right? But there's a difference between saying, hey, the only way that we can take this on as a community is to give up our tradition and reinvent it. Versus, no. Our tradition actually has all the tools necessary to engage with this. And so my question to you all is, after this class, do you think that the tradition has sufficient tools to take all these issues on or not? Yeah. Good. I was hoping that you were going to ask that question. Oh, sorry. So these are my concluding remarks, and then we'll just open it up, inshallah. Okay. We've talked now for almost 16 weeks about what Islam is and how it is to be understood in the way that is indicative of the tradition of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And what we said was that this approach was a holistic approach to Islamic thought according to Sunni Islam through the lens of these three core disciplines: ilm al-tawheed, theology; fiqh, which is the way that we practice this religion, the legalities of the religion, the rights and wrongs and do's and don'ts; and tasawwuf. And tasawwuf here meaning that science that has been preserved generation upon generation that allows us to understand how to arrive at the objective that the Prophet ﷺ gave us. And تَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَهُوَ يَرَاكَ. So how do I do that? How do I worship God as if I see him? Do I just wake up and just, okay, I'm going to do that? No, there has to be some program that allows for me to see that as reality. And not only just that, but how is that also then providing me tools to be able to help produce culture in such a way that that reality becomes much more easily graspable, right? Or easily acquired by those in my surrounding areas. You know, and this is the point that Dr. Jackson made very clearly, and he's been making for like the past 2 decades now. We've always, you know, and this is something that comes out of this post-classical issue. Who here has ever heard that the doors of ijtihad were closed and during this time period, and because of that, Muslims were unable to live in the modern world in the way that we should have? Okay. Ultimately, what that question is basically saying is that the reason why Muslims are grappling with modernity in this way is because we weren't doing enough fiqh. Okay? Now, let me ask you a question. How many people in this room grew up feeling like the majority of what it is that they learned about this religion was about haram and halal? Okay, so that's basically everybody. How many people in this room grew up learning about Islam as spiritually cultivating the self? Much less. Yeah, much less, right? So it doesn't really seem like our issue is that we were like unaware of fiqh. Secondly, it's not like the issues that we're actually going through are going to be solved by producing more fiqh. Okay? Like, I'll give you an example. Before I was teaching fiqh and theology and all these things, I could have really cared less about all of these subjects. Just keeping it real, okay? But I did care a lot about a whole lot of other things. And a lot of that was motivated by culture and what I believe to be quote unquote cool. And this is kind of, again, Dr. Jackson's point, okay? So the question is, does Islam have anything to offer that discussion on what is cool and what is not cool? Or is that something that has nothing to do with Islam? It has to do with Islam. In what sense? Not in the sense that we're saying we should be motivated by what pop culture has defined as being cool. You know, like what Lil Wayne says is cool because Lil Wayne said it, so I'm going to do it because of that. No. Okay. We have something to offer intrinsic from our own tradition that would tell everyone, including Wayne, what's cool. And if he's down with that, then he's down with that. And if he's not, then we're on a different program and we're cool with it. Like, we have certain motivations that we are instilling in society. We think what's really, really cool is that when someone elderly walks into a room, you get up and let them sit down. That's really cool. It's really cool to see someone who's helping an elderly woman across the street. That characteristic is really cool. It's really cool to be humble. It's really cool to be forgiving. It's really cool to let go of your ego. It's really cool to be honest. It's really cool to love your family, to love your neighbors. Those things are cool. And insofar as you're doing that, we would uplift it as a community and say, that's really cool. And if you're not doing that, or you're doing something completely opposite to that, then we would check that person. And we would check the culture insofar as the way that they're developing what is quote unquote cool. Yeah.
Would it not be counterproductive to try to assign the label of cool onto these things because it's almost as if we're kind of that scared of cool? Does that make sense?
Sometimes people get confused because they think that cool is this kind of like categorical understanding that has been defined in very superficial terms. Right? Like cool is only what pop culture in this particular instantiation has defined as cool.
No, but what I mean is that the phrasing of cool is a very specific historical usage, and so to try to use that to contextualize like things that would be admired as like Islamic sunnah behaviors and like behaviors, is that not then allowing this other paradigm to then define what is the behavior?
That's a good question. It would only insofar as cool necessitates a particular understanding. But you see, we believe in meanings in the world. Like God created meanings in the world. And those meanings, we use language to indicate what those meanings are. So if cool doesn't seem to land on that meaning that exists, then we could use a different word. And we don't have any issue with words. Like we're not, somehow circumscribed by the words that we're using. The modern world, today especially, with the development of postmodernism and that whole framework, the belief is that words create meanings. It's not that there's meanings out there that exist out there and that I'm using words to capture the essences of what those things are. No, they're saying I use words and it creates meanings in the world. And that's why people are like really adamant about this term, not that term, this term, not that term. In the Islamic intellectual tradition, we really don't care. And we actually have an axiom as a result of that that says, La mushaha fil istilah. Like we don't even debate about terms. Just tell me what the term is that you want to use, define it, and then I go off of the assumption of what it is that you've defined that term to be. And we continue to carry on the discourse. Because why? Because ultimately there's a meaning that's out there and I'm trying to capture what that meaning is. And I believe that when I say cool, especially in this society, it's very clear that there's this concept that seems to permeate the way that our society is motivated by certain kinds of behaviors or not. It has nothing to do with law, because law is not cool, right? I mean, that could be a necessary entailment. Like if you're trying to say like, hey, let's make these legal things cool. Now I would have an issue with that, right? Sure.
Is it not dishonest to claim that it is a direct, or rather the only method by which postmodernism understands it? There's a lot of space in postmodernism to do what it is that you're saying, which is to allow words to having to repeat them, that bandwidth.
Sure, but the philosophical paradigm that we're operating on is fundamentally inverted, because the belief is that there aren't meanings that are out there. I mean, this is part of the post-enlightenment development, right? Where it's all just convention, right? So, if I'm wearing a really, really ugly shirt and I write chic on it, now it's chic. And that's really like for them, and if it's chic to me, then it's just chic. Why? Because it's all a product of social construct that has been used in that particular way, and it provides meaning. Versus saying, no, there's meaning that is inherent in the world, in the sense from a Muslim perspective that Allah created that. Okay, al-mabani, al-ma'ani qabla al-mabani, we would say, right? That the meanings precede structure. And so what you're doing actually now with language is you're trying to use it in a manner that captures what that reality is. And so, no, in the world that we live in today, which is highly influenced by postmodernism, we subject meaning to the way that we conventionally use the terms that we're using, rather than the other way around.
I mean, it's my opinion that the quote you understand that I'm speaking as a postmodern in a very popular sense is very
Yeah, that's true.
the actual thought of postmodernism. I think that's where I'm taking like some issue, but like I take
Yeah, I mean, this is just more kind of the way that philosophically you would understand the difference between pre-modern thought insofar as their ontological beliefs versus where we are today in terms of ontology. So it's really a study that is done in the philosophy department. It's not actually done in the cultural anthropology department. They're not really, interrogating their assumptions in the cultural anthropology department or in comp lit departments. They don't care, right? They're kind of running with what has already been produced. Most students, as a matter of fact, who go into these departments, that's part of the problem, is that they don't really know what their assumptions are in the work that they're doing in these departments. So like, how much do you actually know about Foucault and what he's developed insofar as this framework that you're working within when you're trying to do cultural anthropology today? I would argue that many students are unaware of it. Right? And it's extremely reductionist. Now, it's okay if you're saying like, look, I do this work in this domain, and I'm not saying that this is like the entirety of one's worldview. But the problem is that it does permeate in that way because none of those assumptions are ever interrogated. You get what I'm saying? And so insofar as we don't interrogate them, we don't realize that it's reductionist in that manner. People that are going into these departments, they actually do have this worldview as this comprehensive worldview of everything. Like everything can be broken down into these power dynamics, right? And that to me becomes extremely problematic. And part of the assumptions then from the philosophical perspective is what we're talking about in ontology. Yeah. Yeah, there was another question. Sorry. These are really good questions. Okay. Okay. Austin, did you have a question? Somebody's had a hand up over there. Sundus. Yes. Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Chic is another one. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. No, and that narrative that we talked about in the post-classical period is an imperializing narrative. It wasn't just done to the Muslims, by the way. This is also something that you can find in, Eastern civilizations. It's a tactic that was used. It was a very strong tactic, colonial tactic that was used, and it has that type of effect where you do see yourself as inferior to the standard that has been set out. Ibn Khaldun actually talks about this far before anyone in the 17th and 18th century began to develop social sciences. Ibn Khaldun oftentimes is noted as like the first social scientist in history, right? And if you look at what he writes, it's really interesting, particularly if you're doing work in the social sciences. And he makes this same point that we innately will define the standard by, who is the captive and who ultimately is the ruler. And that relationship ultimately, it can be broken if it's simply just physical. But insofar as it permeates into mental or intellectual issues, that's much harder to break. They say that, for example, in the beginning, the Muslims, took on the onslaught of an intellectual invasion with the Greek intellectual heritage coming in and people trying to figure out what exactly to do with it. And we managed to get through that. And then there was the physical onslaught with the Mongols, right? The sacking of Baghdad in 1258, which like really just ripped apart Muslim community physically, okay? And because it was physical though, within 100 years, the majority of these Mongols became Muslims. It's really interesting. It just shows you the intellectual depth, right? That plays into the way that people are influenced or not influenced by certain things. In the modern period, there are both things happening simultaneously. And it's, ultimately because of that, that many, political theorists today looking at this concept will say it's much more of a struggle. It's physical on many levels, but it's also highly intellectual on many levels. And it's because they really did penetrate the Muslim intelligentsia in that way that we're stuck here. And I believe that to be the case. Truly, I do. I think that Muslims have bought in, intellectually speaking, that our way of life and our tradition really is inferior to what these people are doing out here in the West. Now, I also think that the response that's been taken by modernist ideological movements have also been problematic, because in many ways, it's somewhat of an opposite extreme. It's kind of like, here's my Islam, eat it, and that's the only way that becomes a modality of identity for me, where I have to make sure that you know that I'm a Muslim, and I'm like throwing it in your face. You know what I mean? And I would argue that a lot of our communities out here in North America, that's kind of what is in the background motivating a lot of how we do Islam. And there are narratives that are continually propped up to make us constantly see that in light of the way that we understand what this religion is. Which is why I think it's extremely important for Muslims who live in North America and have only really seen Islam done in North America to travel. Go to the Middle East, go to Turkey, go to West Africa, like really go to West Africa. And you will begin to see very different expressions of Islam in ways that will allow you to kind of see the way that Islam is permeated in your own society and how you may or may not have taken on a certain disposition as a result of it. Like those are the things that people that have lived overseas will tell you very quickly when they come here. It's like my Islam is constantly on blast. Like I gotta be Muslim all the time here. Versus like when I was living overseas, I'm just living life. I'm just living my life. Like I don't understand. Like why do I gotta always be, in your face protesting this and I'm not saying those things are really important, but if that is what you've taken on as a modality of identity, like the only way that you can be authentically Muslim is this kind of like, shoving Islam down the face of the oppressor. Well, that's also going to be a little bit problematic. Because what happens when there are no more quote unquote oppressors in that sense? Then it's kind of like, well, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Like, what is my Islam now? And this is again part of what Dr. Jackson has been, saying for years. Like, do not take on a modality of identity that forces you to have to be anti-status quo in order for you to be who you are. It's a very dangerous position to be in. And that doesn't mean that we're still not checking people and calling out oppression. Like all those things are there. Yes. But it's putting that in context and allowing it to be properly placed in relationship to who you are as a Muslim or as a Muslim. Yeah.
So you mentioned spirituality, right?
Yeah.
And then other people who are taught along. So when I converted, I was only taught that focus along. How do I reach that spiritual aspect?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're all looking for it. There are some good people here in this community. Alhamdulillah, you can reach out to them. It's the real answer to this is to understand these frameworks properly, first off, and to know that tasawwuf is what ultimately is the standard by which Muslims, historically speaking, have understood this concept of ihsan. And it provides you very specific frameworks for you to be able to do this properly. And they'll tell you that at the end of the day, what it really is you applying the Sharia. Like tasawwuf in its haqiqah is an application of the Sharia. But what is it exactly? Like, what's the program exactly? The gist of it is that you are getting rid of vices that you have inculcated throughout your life and that are somewhat inherent to the way that you've been created. And so you're kind of controlling them, you're learning how to control them, and you're taking on virtuous qualities. It's an inward struggle. It's a struggle for sincerity. It's a struggle to recognize that you are your own worst enemy. Like, much of what you see as reality is manifesting from you ultimately, and to be in control of that means that you're beginning this kind of like inward journey. Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. You know, one of the sayings oftentimes that's attributed to the Prophet, and there's speculation about it, but the meaning is sound. He said, whoever knows himself or herself knows God. I.e., that you're coming into an understanding of the self, the deficiencies that you have, and trying to overcome them, and then ultimately realizing that that overcoming means this utter dependency and reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you then bring about these realizations from within. And that is your human potential. Like, your human potential lies in following the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and realizing these inward states. And the inward states have to be coupled with the outward states. In other words, those two things have to go side by side. So the rules are still important. You know, the rules are still important. The haram and halal is important. It's just not the whole religion. And so there has to be language and frameworks that then allow us to transcend simply just talking about our religion through haram and halal. Exactly. So really quickly, just so that I can finish up and then we'll take these questions. These three sciences make up the core sciences. It's fundamentally important for us to learn these sciences and to learn them properly, right? And alhamdulillah, this is an institution that has and continues to teach these sciences at a beginner level, foundationally speaking. There are other institutions that do so, but it's really important for you to do it, okay? As for the dimension of fiqh, okay, so we talked about tawheed. Tawheed, it constructs and affirms the foundations that are used to build upon the practice of the religion. It's the asl, it's the foundation. Usul ad-din, right? We call it usul ad-din, the foundation of the religion. Why? Because it's the foundation, it's that platform that all the other sciences are going to build off. The first one being fiqh. Okay, as for fiqh, it clarifies how human practices, how one practices the religion, the rules. And then as for the dimension of tasawwuf, it clarifies the approach of spiritual wayfaring for the human being, derived from the practices of fiqh, which are built upon the foundations of the religion. So you see how they're all building upon one another. And so as a result, there can never be a conflict between any of these dimensions, from the theologians, the jurists, and the Sufis, these people who are about spiritual wayfaring. All of them necessarily work in conjunction with one another. So the question then is, okay, what is upon us after coming to know the paradigm of proper Islamic thought, right? i.e. Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. What's required from us to do after knowing who we are and what our objectives entail, and really coming into an understanding of that, is that we take that knowledge into the different sectors that we all belong to, and that we all in many ways carry experiences and expertise and skill sets within, and attempt to begin to influence some type of change within that realm that comes directly from the knowledge that you're taking from this religion. It's not simply just the task of the Muslim scholar, right, to try and figure out how to bring Islam in this holistic manner into engagement with modern society. I can do it as an academic. And in reality, I'm really speaking to like 5 people, especially because I do kalam, so it's like really 3 people, okay? But someone who's an artist in here, you're doing it to like maybe 3 million people. So that's a very different platform than the one that I have. And you have that responsibility upon you. People that are doing it in the realm of health and food, you also have a lot to contribute in relationship to the way in which this tradition is informing what that practice is going to look like. As a therapist, as an engineer, as someone doing work in the tech sector, as someone doing work as a doctor. We have many doctors, alhamdulillah. What's interesting is that very few of them, if any, are actually contributing to the literature within medicine today. Isn't that interesting? So no, we're not just simply going into these sectors from now on and just taking from whatever already exists there. No, we want to contribute to that discussion. And we want for these concepts to permeate the way that these discussions are going to develop and evolve. All right. And we should know that, like, look, the appearance of secularism and modernism, etc., which has sought to displace religion and its coherence in the contemporary period, and to falsify and ridicule religious mandates and to refute the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ, all of them are seeking to dispel religion altogether as a kind of archaic institution that humans have broken free from in the modern world due to their advancements as a species. And this is a very particular group in the contemporary period that we as Muslims have to be very cognizant of. We have to challenge through adab, having proper decorum, because all of it is going to happen through adab. All change happens through adab. But we have to take it on. And ultimately, this will help treat this way of thinking by engaging with them in all of these different sectors that I've talked about. And we also need to engage in very meaningful discussions, things that help reveal the truth of this religion to our co-religionists. And this is whether you're talking to Christians or Jews or Buddhists or Baha'is or Qadianis, seeing where the obfuscations are, recognizing them, and then bringing that into conversation with what you know to be true. And again, doing that with proper adab. And it's not simply just sufficient for us to constantly have these intra-faith issues and, try to work those things out and then completely neglect the interfaith discourse as well. That's really important. The last thing, we also have to be very mindful of the revivalist trends of these concepts that we've taken already in our tradition and how they become sort of awakened in the world that we live in today. So there are trends, revivalist trends of corporealist thought today. There are trends of the early Mu'tazili thought that are being deployed in the contemporary period today, okay? For example, the perennialist movement, okay, that basically are just saying that the Prophet Muhammad is only a prophet that was sent to the Muslims, and all other religions, which they should simply just follow whoever their prophet was sincerely, and that's sufficient to enter Jannah. Like, no. We believe in capital T truth. And again, it's not something that we're trying to say people should go like slam down your throat. But you should be very aware of the fact that these truths are truths with a capital T. And the way to engage that ultimately then is something that we take in the study of what it is that we've understood, but more so in the study of what's to come when we do our studies in Sirah and our studies in spirituality. Because as you will come to see, overwhelmingly, Muslims entering into a society and transforming that society had very little to do with argumentation and debate and dialectic. Those things are important, and they're oftentimes important for the examinational capacity that we have to understand whether or not these things are true or not. That comes out in your disposition, though. It's part of the adab. Like, somebody knows if you're having a conversation with me and you really are completely uncommitted to anything other than truth, versus you having a conversation with me knowing that like my team, my way or the highway. Okay? It's that first disposition that we hope to take on. We're people of truth. And wallahi, like I don't care if it's this religion or any other religion. If it's true, I'm for truth. Because ultimately we believe that al-haq, the reality, the truth is what we're all after. All of us. And insofar as it harmonizes to the things that I've been able to present to you here, alhamdulillah. And if there's something else, show me. I'm willing to look at it as someone who's seeking truth constantly for the rest of my life. And I'm not just here because this is my team. There's that. And the second and most important, in my opinion, is someone who ultimately loves humanity and is seeking to serve them. Irregardless of their religion, irregardless of the positions that they've taken. And I'm not saying, again, you can always take these concepts and go extreme with them. People that are doing wrongs should be called out and should be made, accountable for those wrongs. But how do I feel about them in my heart? Like, what do I ultimately want for them? I want guidance for them. And anybody who's tasted guidance after not being guided, you are very aware of, like, I would want this for everyone. Like, there isn't a single human being who I would not want this for. Building within yourself the capacity to have that, where you are looking at every single person with real love, genuine love, ultimately wanting for them the same way that, and again, it's really interesting when you have children, I think it becomes so much more clear, at least for me it was, because I look at my son and sometimes he annoys me, but it's like, I love this kid so much. I've never known love like this, And what's interesting is when your teachers look at you in that same way, you recognize that that's the objective, is to really inculcate within yourself the ability to see everyone like that. That you're looking at, and people know when you're looking at them in that way, and it can transform their life. And insofar as what it is that you're going to be presenting of what this tradition is, it's very easy for people to understand. It's a lot harder for them to think, how can I commit to this in a very real way? And that oftentimes happens when they see something, they experience something from the community and the people around them that allow them to see, to really taste that reality. So may we all be able to inculcate that light that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ imbibed in everything that he did and in all the places that he went. Inshallah, we've taken that on. We continue to strive to take that on and to give it to everyone that we come into contact with. هذا وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us a sound understanding of our religion and to allow us to grow. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for the shortcomings that we've talked about or discussed or imbibed in this series. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to benefit from that which was beneficial and allow us to rid ourselves from that which was not beneficial. اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى ولك الحمد إذا رضيت ولك الحمد بعد الرضا ولك الحمد كالذي نقول خير مما نقول ولك الحمد كالذي تقول ولك الحمد على كل حال. اللهم إنا نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى. اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل. اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل. اللهم إنا نسألك العفو والعافية والمعافاة الدائمة في الدين والدنيا والآخرة. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. اللهم يا الله يا الله يا الله اقضي حوائجنا ظاهرا وباطنا. نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم ارزقنا حسن الخاتمة. اللهم أعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. يا عالم السر منا لا تهتك الستر عنا وعافنا واعف عنا وكلنا حيث كنا واجعل آخر كلامنا لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله كما يليق بكماله. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله. بارك الله فيكم.